So I'm with the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust. Real quickly, we've been around since 1993, kind of an innovative partnership between conservationists and farmers working to basically make farming a bit more viable, especially by addressing soil fertility and maintaining that soil fertility, and at the same time providing habitat for wildlife, primarily migratory birds. We've got several programs, our grassland set-asides, our winter cover crops, but what I'm going to talk to you today is about our hedgerow program, and specifically some of the functional elements of hedgerows. So, I don't know, this is just going to be a little suite of eco ideas, you know, talking about the ecology of some native trees and shrubs. The primer in the event, the seminar pamphlet's a bit of a tease. I'm not going to talk too much about hedgerow or food production in these hedgerows, other than to tell you about some of the different berries that you can get. Where are we in this big giant map? There we are, right there. The Fraser River Delta, BC's mightiest river, and here it comes out all around Lulu Island, Westham Island, and Sea Island. Lulu Island's the name of Richmond, for all of you who didn't know that. An amazing deltaic system, hugely productive soils. Some of them are still open to agriculture as they are in Delta. We've gone the route of the grey concrete in most of Richmond, and huge ecological function of this area. Back in the day, if we look back at some of the old surveyors' notebooks, we could see what was going on here ahead of time. This is an amazing resource. This is a resource by North Dunn and Teversham. If you're interested in historical land or vegetation, I suggest checking this out. So, I'm going to tell you about our hedgerow program, but who cares about native trees and shrubs? Why would we go ahead and do that? Well, if we look back at what this delta looked like before we diked and drained it for agriculture and then developed it further, we've got these really neat assemblages of grasslands here in the tan, and then in the pink we've got shrub grassland communities. In the purple we've got some real strong shrub communities, and in certain areas along here we've got a lot of like tall tree communities going on. Real stark contrast to the hillside of Vancouver that was quite a mix of different deciduous and coniferous forests. So trees and shrubs were a part of the landscape in Delta and Richmond before we diked and drained it. There's just some more legends. So imagine, if you will, this is what you would see if you could go back in time and see this landscape before kind of the European system of agriculture arrived and started really changing it. But today, it doesn't look like that. We've got farm fields and whatnot, but intermixed among these farms fields, we still have perennial woody habitat. So trees and shrubs. Some of them are just free growing at the side of the fields. Some of them are introduced species like the European hawthorn. We still have the native hawthorn, black hawthorn growing here as well. Poplars and whatnot. So we're still retaining some of that function, that ecological function in the form of trees and shrubs. And like for instance along this roadway on the other side of this is a greenhouse, but we've got a nice mix of deciduous and coniferous trees growing along the margin of that field. So going beyond just saying, well, there's some stuff out there, trees and shrubs growing, we actually go out and actively plant it. And so far we've probably got about 5 kilometers or so of trees and shrubs that we've planted in Delta over the life of the program. And we go out and incur all the costs for doing this. And these trees and shrubs are eligible for a cost share. So we'll actually say to the farmer, look, you're putting aside some of your land for this non-farm use. At least it's non-farm use at this stage of the game. We're just calling this habitat. So we say, we'll recognize some of your lost opportunity costs and give you that $300 an acre cost share as somewhat of an incentive. And we'll run that over a 10-year contract with the farmer. Just to kind of briefly go through the dramatis persona of our hedgerows, we've got a number of great native species that we grow in there. The salmonberry and the thimbleberry, I'll mention those because those are berry-producing plants. I don't know if you could ever economically harvest those crops, but you know, maybe that's something for people in the audience to think about. Roses, there's several different species of native roses. Mostly we use the Nootka rose. But again, there's room there to look at kind of things like using rose hips and whatnot for different for different products. So I'll just allude to that. We use the native beaked hazelnut in the old hedgerows there. So that's kind of a neat one. We don't have a lot of hazelnut producers where we are out in Delta, and I guess right now we're talking about, they're talking about current varieties of hazelnuts as well as some of the diseases that affect them. That's always something to think about when you're planting a native species and maybe in amongst cultivated, similar cultivated species, is to think about disease transfer. I ain't an expert on it, so it's something just to consider. Some of the vacciniums, like we've got the blue huckleberry as well as the the red huckleberry. These have the potential to perhaps be food-bearing crops for people, but they sure provide food for wildlife. And of course, one of my favorites, Saskatoonberry, we plant that as well. They're looking pretty hurting. It's the end of the year. It's nursery plants. They'll be fine once we get them in the ground and irrigate them. Hawthorn's one of my favorite, really seems to grow well in our Delta system, and indeed it was one of the most prolific of the native trees and shrubs before diking and draining occurred. And we like to mix it up with some conifers as well. Back in the day, the conifers would have grown on probably the higher and drier sites, but the way we do our hedgerows now, we just slam them all together and try to get a real nice diverse mix on the edge of the farm fields. And over time, this picture's a little dim, but basically you get this sense, you see here, this nice solid chunk of structural habitat that's there on the margin of a field that otherwise would probably just be reed canary grass or blackberries. So I'm talking a lot about ecological function here, not so much economic return, but that's a component of this whole system, and part of the story as we're talking about is why agroforestry can be interesting. So I guess if you're talking about these things as providing habitat and function, well, what is that function? And what do you want to get out of it? What is it, regional conservation goals for it? And how do you actually achieve that function? So I guess what I want to impart on you is really think about what you want to get out of you want to get out of these things, and how you're going to go and actually measure that. So are you looking for bird habitat on these farms? Like, is that what you want to have? Well, which species are you going to be targeting, and how does that species actually going to utilize this habitat, and will it in fact actually support them, or in the long run be a hindrance to them? In general, when we talk about these hedgerows in Delta, oh no, I'm jumping ahead, I'm doing something else here. Pollinators. This one's one that provides some ecological benefit, but we can also make the argument that this has high value to agricultural production, especially if you require the service of a pollinator for a berry or perhaps like a squash or cucurbit crop. Again, I just want to impart on you, you want pollinators, that great, but which ones do you want, and how do they live, and how is your hedgerow going to support them in that endeavor? I think beneficial arthropods is a really neat topic that these different field margin habitats can have, but again, which ones do we want? Are they going to be, functionally successful in your agro-ecosystem? I don't know. And again, windbreaks, how windy is it? And how much is your hedge actually having an effect on moisture and airflow in a farm field? And then another topic I wanted to touch on is, using these hedgerows as organic buffers. Great, you planted some trees and shrubs. Are the guys who check off the paperwork going to be satisfied with that level of tree and shrub buffer, or did you not do enough? So, and then there's also that functional aspect. You've got a buffer of trees and shrubs, and you're saying, well, this is my protection of my crop to keep other non-intended sprays off of it, but is it really working? You have to ask yourself that, and ask that of what the consumer is getting too. So looking at bird habitat, we've done some studies back in the day in Delta. We just basically looked at the number of species using different field margin habitat. This little chap, the savanna sparrow, we see him in all sorts of different habitats. And there he is, just perched on this blackberry jumble at the edge of a field. Then we start looking at some of the different hedgerows that we've planted, and you see some of these younger hedgerows are still growing, they're still infilling, they've got a lot of height and structure to gain yet. And then we start looking at some places that have very mature hedgerows. This is almost we'd call a woodlot, given by its size and shape, but there is indeed some really nice old established plantings of native trees and shrubs in Delta. They give us a nice contrast. If we start looking across at breeding bird surveys, we see that there's quite a lot of variability in the number of species we see in these different habitats, but I'd like to point out the general trend. When you don't have any kind of real defined field margin habitat other than some blackberries or some reed canary grass, you know, you get just over 5 species, but there's quite a wide overlap. Getting into some of these Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust trees and shrubs planted in the hedgerow program, we start getting a few more species. There's some variability in the data. You know, can we say that this is statistically different? I would dare say not. But as we start looking at these more mature plantings of trees and shrubs, we get more diverse assemblages of species. Some overlap in the variability there, but I think generally we can assert that the older and more structurally diverse, the more species we are supporting. And what's interesting to see is, you know, and it's not surprising if you think about how these different species live and their dependence on, you know, taller trees. Some of these birds here, you know, hunt by hawking insects from on top of trees, flying out from a perch, catching an insect, flying back. You get the sense and you understand that they need these kind of diverse, structurally diverse habitats with lots of food. Things like cedar waxwing, you're not going to find tons of them on, you know, blackberry jumbles unless it is berry season. But, you know, a lot of these different sparrows and warblers can utilize a more kind of structurally diverse hedgerow versus another field margin. So I think we're making the argument that you provide some habitat for birds in these trees and shrubs. I'm always cautious, though, about how much benefit's happening with these. We've got things like brown-headed cowbirds, which are nest parasites. They live in agricultural habitats. You know, does having a hedgerow where maybe a bird comes to breed, is that actually detrimental because the cowbird's going to find it? You know, you've got birds nesting in the grass next to these hedgerows, but they're very linear, defined habitats. They're not very wide. Do you have a chap like this moving down that corridor, finding every little egg that he comes across? He eats the corn out of my backyard too. But you get some neat things going on as well. I mean, perch areas for raptors. I mean, we here at UBC Farm, we got, you know, resident redtail that likes to hang out. He perches up there in this, you know, really mature tree stand we've got here, as well as on perch poles. So do you gain some of those functional, you know, ecosystem benefits? You know, you start closing in these canopies of these trees and you start getting really neat birds moving in there. You know, it doesn't take much to have these barred owls moving in. And this great horned owl, you're like, wow, he's really thick into the forest there. But this is a tree on the dike on Westham Island. There's not much else around, and it didn't take much to give this guy a safe place to hide out, and then he can move into the marsh at night and maraud little animals. I think really, though, you know, supporting pollinators is a really strong argument for providing flowering trees and shrubs on your landscape, especially if it fits within your crop production system. As you move into berries and things like that, I think it's imperative to maintain pollinators on the landscape. You've got to kind of plan with how these flowers bloom. Most of them only come on in spring and midsummer. Things like mock orange, this is willow, you don't see the flower, but that comes on quite early in the year. Roses, even maple flowers right before blueberries. So it's a great way to kind of build pollinator populations before they're getting ready to do your crop. You know, if you're planting these hedgerows, though, for those kind of pollinating insects, you can also start planning for those periods of shortages in pollen and nectar when these trees and shrubs are not flowering late in the summer and early in the fall. And you can get around that by, you know, flowering annuals and things like that. So down here in the lower section, we've got goldenrod in this hedgerow here, and that's a really great way of providing nectar throughout the season. Anyways, I just like always throwing up a list of plants that are great for native pollinators. But they don't just eat, they sleep, they raise young, and they need a place to do that. Well, maybe we can get that out of the hedgerow as well. It might provide nesting habitat. In Delta, we mound the soil, and I'll show you pictures of that in an established hedgerow. And that can provide burrows for small mammals, which then become a place for these pollinators to find a nest. Other things like dead plants like willow that maybe gets killed off by a willow borer, that provides excellent cavities for solitary bees to nest in as well. So having that kind of habitat, having these other little creatures in the ecosystem like Townsend's vole and things like this little shrew, which builds a really neat little nest. That's like 4 shrew babies next to that quarter. That's now a place that a bumblebee could find a home. And even this little fellow, the marsh wren singing on a hawthorn, he builds a nest one year in the reeds. He says, oh, I'm done with that one. And here's that nest. It's tough to see in this picture, but here's the marsh wren's nest. And there's bumblebees crawling all over it because now they're using that as their nesting habitat. So really neat synergistic ecological interactions happening in these habitats. You don't get that with, you know, scorched earth policy to agriculture. When you till right to the ditch, you don't have that. So, you know, just a note on beneficial arthropods. There's so many of them. There's so many questions to ask of, you know, their intended function within an agro-ecosystem. You know, a big one a farmer might ask is like, is he saving me cash? Am I making more cash by having them? Tough to say. But there's, you know, you've got to really think about, you know, how these hedgerows might be a benefit to these arthropods. And I can't answer that question, you know, to you right now. That's a whole day seminar, I'd say. But, you know, you can think about the function of the hedgerow in terms of providing wintering habitat for these, you know, predators. Maybe they're migrating daily between the crop and the hedgerow. Maybe they need to spend part of their life cycle within the hedgerow, and then they can be of benefit in the crop. And in some cases, maybe the hedgerow itself is actually a barrier to movement to these, you know, beneficial insects. So just in terms of thinking about, you know, this Carabidae predatory ground beetle, here's your hedgerow on the right-hand side. And sure, maybe it does come into the crop at night and maraud little cabbage loopers and, you know, pick them off the ground where they're spending the night. Or pardon me, going up into the vegetation where they're feeding, or getting them during the day maybe. But how far into the field is it going to move, and is that actually functionally giving you actually control of your pest in that system? It's a question that you have to ask yourself. And again, an area that I'm, you know, grossly out of my league talking about, but, you know, what kind of pest insects are residing in these hedgerows? You know, lygus bug or something like that. That would, you know, growers might not care to know that that's, you know, harboring that insect. Maybe they're just there incidentally. Maybe that's of benefit to having them around. Not so beneficial arthropods. Any blueberry growers in the crowd are cringing right now. Spotted wing Drosophila, we don't like it. And all those flowering plants that produce berries are now providing alternative habitat for these animals to breed, and therefore, you know, become a threat in our commercial berry crops. So, you know, you're growing blueberries, and does having huckleberries and salmonberries in that hedgerow increase the problem you might have with spotted wing Drosophila? I don't have the answer, but it's something I think that's really important to think about. Organic buffers, you know, how big are they? What do they need to be? You know, 8 meters wide. We don't plant hedgerows as wide as 8 meters out in Delta. And what are your production costs, you know, of one, taking out that land from production, and two, you know, how much cost does it to put in a hedgerow that's 8 meters wide? I say it's going to cost a lot, especially if you've got to do a kilometer or more. Okay, but anyways, I wanted to kind of lead you through some of the things we do to plant a hedgerows, just so you can kind of think about some of the stuff that goes into it. Here's our site. It's pretty bare. There's not much going on. And out in Delta, we basically bring in some topsoil and create a berm. We do that, one, I talked about the benefit to pollinating insects, as, you know, and having habitat for them, but really the idea is to get those trees out of the soil a little bit before the winter rains come. We have usually high winter water tables, so we want to give them something nice and easy to root into before they start to penetrate into that tough Delta silt clay soil and have to contend with the water. So you dump your soil, you get Billy Bobcat out there and you level it out and you make it, and then it's time to plant. So you get a bunch of volunteers out planting it. The lady in the striped shirt, she's not doing much, she's just standing next to her shovel. That's a no-no in the landscaping world. Even if you got a show shovel, do something. So the manager had a talk with her after. We built the berm up. You see the irrigation lines running. It's just you get so much more growth when you irrigate. It's so costly. Something like this, a system like this with a timer, which keeps you from, you know, overusing water, $4,000, $5,000 at least. So there's a cost to doing that, and you know, that's probably for a 500 to 600 meter stretch. So very expensive, but you won't lose as many plants that you spend time, money, and effort planting, and you'll get quicker growth and quicker establishment of that hedgerow. So that's a real poor picture. Let's just keep moving. That's a real poor picture too. What I wanted to show here is some crispy plants that didn't have irrigation. What's the point in that? So you're doing a hedgerow. Again, it's kind of dim, but this is actually along Highway 99, just before the Highway 10 overpass here. Check this out. You can see these little stickies off here. If you see this big giant cedar hedge that covers the nursery, try to spot our hedgerow. It's grown quite prolific over the last 2 years that it's grown. But one thing that was an issue with this one was weed control. So we've got this bare soil that we brought in. We can see our trees and shrubs are planted in there. But over time, this soil comes with a ton of weeds, and if it doesn't come with weeds, enough blow in to really kind of infill these habitats and start providing real competition for your trees and shrubs. So anything from like sweet clover, canary grass, vetch is a bad one because it'll grow right up and over your trees and shrubs. You name it, there's stuff that competes and grows quite well out there in Delta. Back in the day, you used to throw down bark mulch and stuff as kind of a cover to control the weeds. I don't know, weeds germinate in that stuff. Soil blows in, they germinate. It doesn't really matter. I don't find it's a useful investment in terms of weed control. What we've experimented with this year was using clover as a living mulch, so seeding clover down. So here's kind of our little chunk. It's again difficult to see on this picture, but you see bare soil right now. But we went in and seeded clover, and that is what this whole area is here on this photograph is all clover established. Is the clover competing with those trees and shrubs? Yeah, but better the enemy you know than, you know, things like it's not a thistle, but there's a really bad big one that grows. It's spiky and hard to pull up. Sweet clover grows up, reed canary grass grows up, and what we've seen thus far is this clover seems to be outcompeting some of those weeds once you do an initial weed up on it. So it can kind of stop some of that late germination of weeds that you might otherwise have to contend with. Aesthetically, I think it looks quite pleasing. It's a nice little cover. Here's a line of trees and shrubs we've planted, and there's this nice clover growing down in the understory below. And back to our little friends, the pollinators. Great. Now we've kind of encouraged some beneficial arthropod pollinators to use that habitat quite quickly. As the clover dies and, you know, there's turnover in the roots and whatnot, it's going to be sloughing off those inoculated rhizomes, and indeed the roots of this are inoculated with rhizobium, so they are fixing nitrogen. So it can be perhaps slowly releasing nitrogen into the soil and making that available for the crop plant. Other challenges that come up, here's another dim picture for you to have me interpret for you. Here's a slough. Here's a bank of reed canary grass. This is a blueberry field off here. Here is a planting of trees and shrubs. So we've got trees and shrubs next to the slough. It looks nice. It's a great place to have trees and shrubs overhanging water. What could go wrong? So here's some pots here. Those were cottonwood and some real nice big leaf maple, and you're like, well, where's the tree, Dave? Billy Beaver came up in the middle of the night and took them all and chewed them all off. These have all resuckered and grown into new trees, but boy, we were kind of surprised, you know, when we came in the morning and couldn't find the trees. So, you know, that's a legitimate concern in a lot of areas in the lower mainland when you're planting trees and shrubs. Who's going to eat it? So what we did in this site here, where we've got the slough right next to it, we put chicken wire around this, and we basically protected those trees so the beaver couldn't get in there. There's also eastern cottontail running around there, and they'll nibble on the small shrubs. So you can't protect every single tree, but it made pertinent sense to protect some of these trees that were right next to the slough. We already talked about this fellow today. This is Himalayan blackberry. we can thank Luther Burbank for the russet potato. We can thank him for this one as well. So really grows prolific here in the lower mainland. It grows by shooting up canes and sends up new canes each year. It will scaffold its new canes on the old canes that it grew, and it will scaffold up onto your hedgerow trees and shrubs as well if you let it, and basically, you know, shade them out and outcompete them. So what are you going to do? Well, you've got to pull it out, and that, you know, requires a lot of labor. You can decide to potentially use chemical treatments on it. I'm not an expert on which ones are effective. I understand spraying Roundup this time of year will actually get translocated down into the root and potentially kill the root, but I don't know much about that. I prefer hand pulling and at least pruning to the ground and trying to keep on top of it, and then trying to manage that vegetative canopy to close off really quick. But I mean, the little birds we're trying to conserve in these hedgerows are pooping out the blackberry seed, and then it grows, you know, in the understory of these hedgerows. So it's a constant maintenance challenge. It's probably close to $10,000 a year problem for maintaining these hedgerows and keeping on top of them by the time you add it all up. And this is just one of those real thick blackberry patches that, well, it's got some function, but it doesn't have the same function and as diverse a function as those native trees and shrubs do, as something like this does.
David?
My pleasure.